Hello, for my discussion, I chose to talk about the biblical theology because after reading this week's material, I think it's one of the most compelling approaches to doing theology. What really stood out to me is that biblical theology helps us see the Bible as one complete story instead of a bunch of separate books or disconnected teachings. Sometimes people read one verse and build an entire belief around it without looking at the context or where it fits into the rest of the scripture. I think that's one of the biggest problems today. Biblical theology helps us avoid that because it teaches us to read the Bible the way that God revealed it, which is progressively, from Genesis all the way to Revelation. One of the readings that helped me understand this was J. Scott Duvall's chapter on biblical theology. He explains that biblical theology traces God's work of redemption throughout Scripture and shows how every part of the Bible connects to his overall plan. That really changed the way I think about reading the Bible, because instead of asking only what does this verse mean, we're also asking how does this fit into God's bigger story. I think that's a much healthier way to study the scripture. Another author that stood out to me was Sigurd Grindheim. He talks about how the Bible was written by many different authors over hundreds of years, but it still has one unified message because it has one divine author. I really like that idea because even though the books of the Bible are different, they're all pointing toward the same thing: God's plan to redeem his people through Jesus Christ. One thing I especially appreciate about biblical theology is that it keeps Christ at the center. When Jesus was talking to his disciples after the resurrection in Luke 24, he explained that the law and the prophets were all pointing to him. That's exactly what biblical theology tries to do. It shows us how covenants, sacrifices, promises, and even the kings in the Old Testament all point toward Jesus. When you start reading the Bible that way, everything begins to connect. Now, I don't think biblical theology is the only important theological method. Systematic theology, historical theology, philosophical theology, and pastoral theology all have their place. Systematic theology helps organize what the Bible teaches into doctrines like salvation, the Trinity, or the Church. Historical theology helps us understand how Christians throughout history have understood those doctrines. Philosophical theology helps answer difficult questions about the faith, and pastoral theology helps us apply biblical truth in the ministry and everyday life. But for me, biblical theology is the foundation that ties everything together. Ryan Putman explains that theology has to begin with God's revelation in Scripture before we bring in tradition, philosophy,